Story 1. I met Robin Williams when I was a kid. He crouched down to my level, made a funny face and said, "Stay weird." I think about that a lot. Story 2. Diana, Princess of Wales, visited our office in 1991 or 1992. I stood about 3 meters from her. I was shocked at how tall she was. In high heels, she was well over 6 feet. Years later, I visited Kensington Palace for an exhibition of her clothes, and there was the outfit she had worn that day. Story 3. Tom Cruise. I was on vacation in Florida, and he has a place in Clearwater. I just happened to pass him on the street. I said hi, and told him I loved all of his movies, but that his best role ever was either Les Grossman or Stacey Jacks. He laughed and said, "Thank you." That was the entire extent of our interaction. I'm pretty sure he tells that story at parties, just as I do. It was epic for both of us. Story 4. Margaret Thatcher. My dad was a member of the Conservative Party, and he took me along to a conference. I was 6 years old. I shook her papery hand, and she asked me if I wanted to be a Conservative member of Parliament when I grew up. I was shy and just shook my head. Story 5. For me, either Jimmy Carter or Slash. Jimmy was back in the 1990s, holidaying in Scotland. I met him with my grandparents, very vague memories of it. Slash was in the late 2010s in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He came out of an elevator in a hotel with his Les Paul case, smirked at me full of cold, probably because I had a blank, cold expression, and walked off. Bonus chance of seeing or meeting. I saw Ren, of Sick Boy and Hi Ren, recently. I was having lunch at a pub with a workmate, and he walked past on the street talking to someone. I didn't say hi. I heard he isn't a huge fan of that sort of thing. Story 6. Mac Miller was at a house party in Pittsburgh while studying abroad for a year. He asked me for a lighter, and I had no idea who he was, which he found very amusing and kind, I guess. We had a nice chat. I got into his music years later and realized I had met a legend. Rest in peace. Story 7. I ran into James Gandolfini at Hoffman's Ice Cream in Point Pleasant. He was with his nephew, so I left him alone. Story 8. I have met every president since William Jefferson Clinton and a few notable prime ministers. After retiring from the military, I worked in executive security and met numerous celebrities and politicians. Story 9. Shirley MacLaine, Jose Carreras, Elton John, Sam Neill, Kylie Minogue, Michael Hutchence, George Michael, Andreas Scholl, Tiger Woods, Leonardo DiCaprio, Joel Grey, Patrick White, Richard Boninge, King Constantine of Greece with his wife and son, and the Kronos Quartet. I used to be a waiter. Story 10. Leonard Nimoy. Standing in line at T's Rotisserie in Incline Village, Nevada, I was shocked at how tall he was. He never seemed to tower over other actors, but that man was tall. Story 11. Hillary Clinton stopped by my local union while I was taking a class there. I was taken aback by how pretty her eyes were. Story 12. If met means seen with my own eyes, then either Linkin Park, Still with Chester, or Imagine Dragons. If it means actually interacted with, then Starset. Story 13. I met Vin Diesel at a Los Angeles club in my 20s. He was drunk, adorable, very short, extremely jolly, and so sweet. There is nothing wrong with being short. I just was not expecting him to be close to my size. Story 14. I have met a number of celebrities, but 4 stand out. Bruce Willis sat at our table at Planet Hollywood in Spain. This was a school trip, and it was my 13th birthday. He was touring to promote the release of Armageddon and happened to be scheduled to stop there while we were having dinner. Incredibly nice guy. He spent a while hanging out with a bunch of 7th and 8th graders and made you feel like he really wanted to be there. My mom still hasn't forgiven me for not calling her that day. Then, I rode Pirates of the Caribbean with Weird Al, also a super nice guy. It was so random too. He stood in line with everyone else and was low-key, so you almost didn't realize he was there. Then we loaded up, and I was in the row behind my parents and siblings when he plopped right down next to me and said something to the tune of, "This is going to be a blast." Third, I was a linesman for a youth soccer game and John Elway's kid was playing. Elway yelled at me, a 14-year-old, for not calling offsides. You couldn't call it unless the ball was touched by the player while still offside, which did not happen. I, the linesman, got approval from the referee to give him a warning. Last, Sinbad had 4 bodyguards coming out of medieval times. They shoved my little brother to the ground, and Sinbad was loud and basically saying, "That's right, I'm Sinbad. Get out of the way." I have also had the pleasure to party with a handful of musicians after shows at smaller venues, but those are all the same story of getting drunk and stoned and just being around them. Story 15. Chad Kroger saw Nickelback in Corpus Christi and he mentioned going to Walmart afterwards. My dad and I also went for some late-night Walmart shopping, and he was in the electronics aisle looking at PlayStation 2 games. My dad and he conversed for a minute and we went on our way. Story 16. About 5 years ago, I met the local weatherman from a TV station in Minnesota, either KARE 11 or WCCO. I forgot which, when I was working at a fast food restaurant called Culver's. He was there with his family. I delivered his food and spoke to him for a couple of minutes before letting him return to his family at their table. I don't think he works there anymore. I forgot his name. I wish I knew it because I don't watch the local news very often. Please forgive me. Story 17. Queen Elizabeth II. I met her in 2012 for her Diamond Jubilee. I was part of a youth orchestra that had been chosen to play for her. Story 18. I was a very important person handler at an upscale event. As I was waiting for my very important person to arrive, I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was Chris Tucker. My very important person was Rachel Nichols. She is the best, but I wish it was Chris. I spoke to him briefly, and he is exactly the person you see on camera. I loved every bit of that interaction. Story 19. Dave Chappelle and Triple H. 2 very different times, circumstances, and impressions. I forgot Bob Saget after a comedy show. He was just the freaking best. Story 20. I saw Alec Baldwin hanging out with some friends eating food at AJ's, a fancy grocery store in Scottsdale. I did a double take. He gave a smile because he knew I recognized him. I smiled back and moved along, but I was still thinking, it's Alec Baldwin. Story 21. I once tried throwing Dwayne Wade in a pool when he was first drafted by the Miami Heat. He wrestled my friends and me off and kept repeating that he couldn't swim in a playful tone. It was all in good fun and made a great childhood memory. I have also met and worked with many high-end fashion designers, but they are a bunch of out-of-touch people. Story 22. Harrison Ford was in Halifax filming K-19. He had a handler named Tarlau Chano, who was a friend. He brought him into Mexico where I worked, looking for a pot hookup. He was very cool and a little aloof. We chatted a bit about Star Wars and Indiana Jones, mostly me telling him how great they were. Story 23. In 1996, Lisa Bonet was in an elevator in New York City after I had finished an audition for Les Miserables that I did not get. She said hi and mentioned that she liked my Gap jacket. To be honest, I was so exhausted and dejected from the audition that she barely registered to me. Story 24. I met Greg Allman when I was working at Daly's. I said, "You look just like Greg Allman." He said, "I am Greg Allman. Nice guy." Story 25. Danny Trejo and Danny Glover back to back. I went up to Trejo and said, "Look, we got Badass and Badass number 2. Trejo replied, "Not me, man. He's the badass," pointing at Glover. He then wrote, "Machete don't text on my autograph. Dude's awesome." Story 26. Penn from Penn and Teller at a meet and greet after their show. The crowd was bigger around Teller, so I went to Penn. Penn shook my hand and we took a picture. He remarked that the only reason Teller's crowds are bigger is because people want to see if he actually talks. Story 27. Michael Jackson at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. They all shunned him and frankly treated him poorly. Story 28. I have met many actors and voice actors at conventions, but the one that stood out the most was meeting the Terrifier cast. I also met Corpse Grinder from Cannibal Corpse. Story 29. I have met a lot of people at conventions. I am not sure who would be considered the most famous. Henry Winkler was probably the most famous overall since he played the Fonz. Karen Gillan is probably the most famous by today's standards. Story 30. Nathan Fillion, Luke Evans, Haley Joel Osment, Allison Brie, several United States senators and representatives, and the current and former governors of Washington. It is unclear who among them is the most famous. Story 31. When I worked as a cashier at Sam Goody's, I met many celebrities. When Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis came in, it was surreal. Story 32. Former King of Spain, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Andrea Bocelli ran into Christopher Meloni in an elevator in a Los Angeles hotel. He was very cold, which is a shame because I am a big fan, but I did not tell him that. Story 33. Randall Munroe, the XKCD comic creator and all-around genius. Stephen Pastis, the Pearls Before Swine comic creator, at a comic book signing. Story 34. Natalie Portman and Eric Bana were there when I was an extra in a movie. Scarlett Johansson was there as well, but she seemed shy and did not talk to anyone. Story 35. Met the drummer from the band Sublime. I ran up to the cashier to get a Sharpie so he could sign my shirt. Story 36. Shah Rukh Khan. Many people in the United States or United Kingdom may not know who he is. He is Hindi cinema's biggest star, extremely famous worldwide, particularly in Asia. He is a wonderful person. Story 37. More like local or regional celebrity, so let's see if this gives away where I grew up. They were farm show hosts who had locals deliver a farm fact toward the end of their segment. My dad, sister, and I met them when I was around 10 at a farm-based event. My sister and I got to say the farm fact. I was in awe to meet people I watched regularly on television. Brian and Darren Hefty. Story 38. Mitch Easter, Faye, and Sarah from Let's Active came to the University of Rhode Island in April 1984. Somehow they were out of drumsticks, so I went with them in their van to Wakefield Music. They were very nice. Also, Tiny Tim stayed at a hotel where I worked and answered to Mr. Tim. I sold a movie ticket to Anthony Edwards, but I did not recognize him because I had not seen Top Gun. I was more focused on Mary Stuart Masterson, who came in on my night off. Story 39. Who is more famous, Christopher Isaac or Robert Dole? I have shaken Bernard Sanders, William Jefferson Clinton, and Stephen Morrissey's hands, but I do not think that counts. Story 40. Either Dean Cain in the dining facility in Iraq or Nicolas Cage walking down the hall in the children's hospital where I worked. Story 41. Kevin Costner caught our boat lines when we pulled up to a fuel dock in Canadian waters back in 1990. Story 42. I pity the fool who did not get to meet Mr. T really late at night in a fast food restaurant off the toll road in the late 1980s, like I did. Story 43. I saw Ron Jeremy in the airport, gave him a nod, and then we were on the same flight. I used to see and talk to Mr. Cheeks and the Lost Boys so much it was not even surprising anymore. Same with Biz Markie. Dilated people stayed after a show signing autographs and hanging out, and that was pretty cool. They stayed so long the venue nearly kicked out the artists. Story 44. I have played against nearly every famous poker player. Some are very friendly, while others are strictly business. Story 45. Emily Blunt, Josh Brolin, Benicio del Toro, Daniel Kaluuya, Emma Stone, Nathan Fielder, Benny Safdie, Christina Vidal, Scott Bakula, Cheech Marin, Eva Longoria, Jesse Garcia. Story 46. I met Sinbad waiting for a plane at an airport once. Story 47. I always tell this story, though I didn't really meet him. In college around 2012, I was in New York for Model United Nations. It was after all the events had ended, and we were walking down Broadway on our way to dinner. There was a big group of people that I thought were lined up to get into a theater, and one guy on the sidewalk was blocking the rest, talking to someone in the line. When I went by, I lightly put my hand on his back and went past him, not really pushing him, but enough pressure to let him know I was moving by. Something told me to turn around, and Matthew Broderick was looking back at me, obviously a little annoyed that I had touched him. The line was for autographs for nice work if you can get it after one of the shows. During the same trip, we got to say hi to a very drunk Owen Wilson leaving a bar. He was super nice. Also, one night in Atlanta after a Model United Nations event, We saw Ludacris outside a Waffle House near the airport. Story 48. I don't know his name, but he was blindfolded and had urinated on himself. We flew him to a forward operating base in Wardak along with his entourage of walking hulks. They looked like they lifted small sport utility vehicles for fun. I don't know who any of them were, but I would bet not a single one could reach the middle of their backs. They did have some really nice gear, though far beyond our budget. They were nice, but I don't think the blindfolded man liked his 15 minutes of fame. Story 49. I was in Las Vegas once and went to the bar. When I placed my order, I was given my total, only for the man behind me to say that it was on him. I turned around, and Nolan Ryan had just bought me a cocktail unexpectedly. Even aside from that, he was very kind and took time to talk about baseball and his career with me. Story 50. Michael Jordan. I was working at the Ryder Cup at the K Club in Ireland in 2005, and he was one of the guests of one of the television networks. The extent of my conversation with him was asking if he wanted tea or coffee. Story 51. I stood waiting at a crosswalk beside Lawrence Fishburne. This was in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., and half a block away. A group of overweight tourists started screaming, "Look, it's Morpheus." He glanced at me and muttered, "Jesus Christ," and I just smiled and nodded. He was wearing some very nice shoes. Definitely Italian custom. Story 52. And Nancy Wilson from Heart in 1981 were two of the most gracious celebrities I have ever met. Story 53. Scarlett Johansson. My mother works in film production, and the show she worked for inside the actor studio had her on. I got to go backstage with my mother, who introduced me. We took a picture together as well. Story 54. Mark Cuban is a family friend who I have met on multiple occasions. People are always surprised to hear that. John Mellencamp is also a good family friend. My aunt is his personal assistant. Story 55. Bill Gates. I used to be a lifeguard at the club where he played tennis. He would regularly walk through the pool area to get to the locker rooms. It was a nice club, but I always thought it was unusual that he would walk around by himself. Story 56. Rachel McAdams and John Cleese. On different days, I worked as a hotel front desk agent in Santa Monica in 2009. Story 57. Colin McRae. In 1995, I was in Nairobi at the Safari Rally. He gave me an autograph, which I still have today. Very nice person. Rest in peace. Story 58. Well, I ran into Tom Hiddleston at Comic-Con a few years ago. My wife and I saw him in full Loki costume and said, "That's an awesome costume. You did it up great." He just smiled and said thanks. We had no idea it was him until we got home and saw he'd appeared on stage in Hall H wearing the outfit. I also met James Avery, also known as Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and Shredder from the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, as well as Clancy Brown, also known as the Korgon and Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob SquarePants. Take your pick. Story 59. Bill Murray joined our dinner table as an actual encounter. But the most famous was Barack Obama. Our firm bought a table at a fundraiser. He gave an incredible speech and then went table to table, shaking hands and chatting with everyone for at least 5 minutes each. He was incredibly gracious, asked questions, and cracked jokes. Story 60. Daniel Craig. This was around the time Skyfall was a recent movie. I even remember saying to him, "Thank you, Mr. Bond." Also Billie Eilish, but I did not talk to her. I was backstage at the show and was really close to her. Fun fact, she randomly walked out of her dressing room and asked some girls if they wanted to play frisbee with her. They did. Story 61. Not that famous, but Mario Andretti. Nicest guy. He even gave me an autograph in the rain and invited us into his trailer before the race. Story 62. Morgan Freeman. I waited tables at a fine dining restaurant in downtown Memphis. He was a semi-regular, and I was lucky enough to see him come in during one of the 3 shifts I worked there. I walked by and saw a dirty plate, so I took the opportunity to ask, "May I take this plate?" He said, "Sure." Story 63. I met Lil Jon in an airport in Puerto Rico several years ago. It was around the time when Dave Chappelle's Lil Jon skit came out, so people were saying, "Yeah, okay," all around him. My mother took a picture with him and accidentally called him Little Richard. Story 64. Michael Mann worked at a retirement community in Ojai where his mother was a resident. He was always very nice to the staff and never demanding. Story 65. Michelle Obama. I have met many public figures, but I do not think anyone compares to her stature, both literally and otherwise. She has a very rare presence and charisma. Story 66. My father's childhood best friend was head of security for the Dalai Lama in the early 2000s. We went to hear him speak at a retreat in New Jersey and ended up getting a one-on-one audience with him. I am not a Buddhist, but it was pretty surreal. Story 67. Rose Marie played Sally on The Dick Van Dyke Show. She was extremely drunk, but she also had to put up with some pretty obnoxious people, so I would have been drunk too. Story 68. Probably 4 of the 5 members of Take That. The nicest one was Jason. After that, Danny John Jules, Rob Grant, Ross Noble, and all the members of Space, such lovely guys. Very Z-list, but also Terry Christian. He gets bad press, but he was absolutely lovely. Story 69. Donald Trump. It was years ago in the 1990s. We were together on an island with a group of other wealthy older people. I do not remember much. Bill Cosby was acting as bartender, and my drinks were a little strong. I ended up waking up with a sore jaw and my pants off for some reason. The worst part was he never called like he said he would. Story 70. I have been in the same space as the commander-in-chief since 2015 several times. Twice, he told me I have the same haircut as Sean Combs. Story 71. Gosh, a lot. Most famous? Probably Weird Al. Or Jack Klugman, rest in peace. Or Huey Lewis and the News. Or any number of 90s to 2000s country superstars. Or Donald Sutherland, rest in peace. Sometimes I cannot believe how surreal my life is. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.